My name is Derek Fortini. I'm the director of the Estes Park Museum. Today we're going to be interviewing Dr. James H. Pickering, and we are at the Estes Park Museum, and it's November 14th, 2022.
Can you please state your name, birth date, and where you were born?
Sure. James H. Pickering, and I was born in New York City in 1937.
And Jim, can you tell us about the first time you came to Estes Park?
Yeah, I was 10 years of age. My father had gotten to know some people at the University of Nebraska whose parents had a house up in the Twin Sisters. And so we came there in 1947 or so. We were there for about 2 weeks, and that was my introduction to Estes Park. It was a very different era than it is today. All the old-time lodges were still going on, and I thought I was in the middle of the Wild West.
Can you give us a quick overview of the makeup of your family and who would have been here?
Sure. I have a mother and father. I have my sister, Nancy Thomas, who lives here in Estes Park, and my brother Tom lives in I can't remember where he lives. My brother Tom lives in Tennessee.
Did your family have any favorite places in Rocky Mountain National Park that you'd like to share with us?
Now, my folks didn't hike very much, so I suppose their favorite place was on the side of the Twin Sisters, and not bad because we were up on the side of the mountain, looking across at the Tahosa Valley at that east face of Long's Peak, and so that was pretty dramatic. And then in the evening, you go out in the back porch at cocktail hour and look up, and you could see the sun setting on the Twins, and that was always a glorious sight. So the early morning sun, if you got up early enough, on the east face of Long's Peak in the morning, and then the setting sun on Twin Sisters in the afternoon. It was a pretty glorious world.
Can you tell us some memories of the businesses that you would visit when you were young?
Well, we didn't get down to Estes Park Village very often. When we did, it was a kind of a treat. But like most kids, I guess we gravitated to the old Dark Horse. And I remember at the gate there was a stand that sold corn on the cob. I don't think we ever were allowed to have any. But then you walk back across Fall River, back into the Dark Horse and where the swimming pool used to be. And before you actually got into the Dark Horse, and we didn't go in there were a whole series of arcade games. And so it was a dark and exciting place for us on those few days we got to come into the village.
Are there any other childhood stories about Estes Park that you'd like to share?
Not about Estes Park, because I say most of the time that very first summer we were on the Twins, and so we would go horseback riding. Mr. Davis had a stable back behind the old Long's Peak Inn, which still existed. We'd go back there and get horses and ride up to the Virginia Mine, or up to the Boulder Field, or up to Chasm Lake. And it was, for a kid from suburban New York, it was a marvelous introduction to a world totally different than the one I grew up in, and therefore very romantic and exciting.
So before we get back to Estes Park, I just want to touch a little bit on your professional career. Can you just give me a brief overview?
Sure. I went to Williams College as an undergraduate in Massachusetts, back in the Berkshires, mountains that are, compared to these, are mere molehills. But anyway, I grew up with the mountains. Of course, growing up in New York, we had the Adirondacks, which were lovely mountains as well, but again, very, very different from the Rockies of Colorado. Went to graduate school at Northwestern, got my MA and PhD there, and then started my academic career at Michigan State in the English department. I was there for about 3 years, and we had a new chairman came in, and before I knew it, I was the associate chairman and the graduate chairman of the department, which, looking back, I just wondered anybody taking somebody who was 30 years of age and putting him in charge of all the gray-beard professors at the graduate level, but that's what I was doing. So that got me involved in academic administration. I did that for roughly a decade, and then in 1975, became director of the Honors College at Michigan State, which gave me a much larger field of view, field of vision, gave me a chance to look at the university as a whole. And our Honors College was pretty unique back in those days because Michigan State was playing the National Merit Scholars game, and we had more National Merit Scholars among our undergraduates than any school but Harvard. So these were really bright kids, and a number of went on to become Rhodes Scholars during my time there, Marshall Scholars. They were really smart, and the faculty was very devoted to their care and feeding, and it was a great experience. I suppose just from the standpoint of satisfaction with what I was doing, that was probably the highlight of my career. But like many people, after doing things for 6 and 7 years, I get antsy to do something else, and so I moved on. Oh, and then you want to know about where I moved on to. I went down to the University of Houston as the Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts. Did that for about a decade, and then I became the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs. Did that for a couple years, and then I served as president for about 4. So that's my academic career.
It's very impressive. I know that you've written a lot of books outside of Estes Park history. Do you know how many books you've published?
Yeah, I was pretty heavily involved with doing anthologies for the old Macmillan Publishing Company. One of them, an anthology of short stories called Fiction 100, did that in 1974, and believe it or not, 13 years later, that still is in print. And it did a number of other textbooks for them about drama and poetry and how to read fiction and that kind of thing. So I guess probably all in all about 35 or 40 anthologies of one kind or another. All that done before I really started getting involved in the history stuff.
Are there any specific ones you'd like to highlight?
Beg pardon?
Are there any specific anthologies or books you'd want to highlight?
Well, that Fiction 100 was the 13 editions. I guess it highlights itself. It seemed to me back then I was doing a new edition every 2 or 3 years because that was the way that college textbooks played the game. You wanted to kill off the used book market, and the only way to kill off a used book market is to come up with a new edition that the students have to buy. The book was marvelous because the whole concept was that for $5.95 we would sell a textbook with 100 short stories in it. And that textbook, while it kept the same name, Fiction 100, through all the 13 editions, grew in size till there were probably 120, 150, 120 stories in there by the time of the last edition, which still is in print, but it's on its last wobbly legs.
Do you currently have any works in progress that don't focus on Estes Park, or do you only write on Estes Park today?
No, pretty much. I'm pretty much exclusively focused on this place and this time and looking back. And every time I think I've written my last piece, something of interest pokes its head above the ground, and and like a gopher in a hole, I go after it.
How would you say that your professional career has lent to all of the studies and writings that you've done about Estes Park?
I'm not sure there's a relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, the last 20, well, I went when I was teaching, obviously I wasn't teaching Estes Park history, I was teaching American literature and teaching about fiction. I never really have taught history. I've just written about it.
Okay, so we'll get to Estes Park now. Let's just start with what was the first book you wrote related to Estes Park?
Back in the 1980s is when it all began. I didn't have a lot of time because I was involved in academic administration. I was still deaning back in those days. So I began by, I contacted the University of Nebraska Press, And I asked if they would be interested in reprinting some of Enos Mills's anthologies of writings. And so we began with 4 of those, beginning with the wildlife on the Rockies, and doing In Beaver World, which is a marvelous study of the beaver, which is still commended today by naturalists for its observations. And then I did an edition of Joe Mills's A Boy's Life, which he published. I can't remember the date he published it. Must have been 1920s. I think 1920s, 1922, I think. In any event, I did that, and then way later underway, I did a couple of other reprint editions of earlier works. And then when I left administration, I had more time. That's when I really started doing the full-length histories. After I left academic administration, I had a year's sabbatical, and that's when I did This Blue Hollow. And I came out here and spent the better part of the fall. And every day I would go down to Denver, Longmont, Loveland, Fort Collins, and go to the public libraries and use their microfilm readers and look through old microfilms of newspapers. And every time I came across a reference to Estes Park, I'd put a dime in the slot and get a printout. And I just got loads and loads of material. And then when I had reached a certain point, I guess exhaustion, and it was time to go home, I put them together, and lo and behold, by fashioning them into various chapters, a book appeared.
So I'm curious, you're talking about the Mills books that you reprinted. Mm-hmm. Do you remember when you first read any of Mills' work?
No, but back when I came up here as a kid on the Twin Sisters, Enos Mills's boyhood cabin was right below. He, of course, was deceased, but his widow was still there. And they were still fighting the battles of Tahosa Valley. Mills was a contentious fellow, didn't get along very well with his neighbors, and the family we were staying with and their circle of friends were still very, very cautious. I won't say they were anti-Enos Mills, but they warned me to stay away from Mrs. Mills. And so I grew up by having an image of Esther Mills as being the Wicked Witch of the West, which I'm sure she wasn't. She was a naturalist in her own right, and I'm sure I could have learned a lot from her, but I was told to strictly stay away. And of course what that did was that whetted my appetite. I wanted to know more about the mysterious man who was married to the mysterious woman.
So going back to This Blue Hollow, which is still, an authoritative history book here locally, there were other local history books at that time in Estes Park. Was there anything specific that motivated you to pursue your own writings?
Yeah, when back in the 1970s, when we brought the kids up here, we stayed at the Y camp, and they had to go to bed early, and so what do you do in a small cabin? And being interested in history, and we can talk about where that interest in history came from, I would go up to Jellison Library, and I was interested in reading about the history of Estes Park. I had a copy of what's it called? Rocky Mountain Names, the book on nomenclature. And I would go through that, and that was kind of fun because it was a once-over lightly of lots and lots of stuff. But I was looking for in-depth history, and I simply couldn't find any. And so arrogantly I said, I can do a better book than that myself. And ultimately, when I got a chance, that's what I did.
So where did that interest in history come from?
Well, I grew up in New York, and unlike Estes Park, whose history begins in the 1860s, 1870s, New York history, and of course has a Native American past, but its Anglo history starts in 1609 when Henrik Hudson and his ship, the Half Moon, sailed up the Hudson River, established New Amsterdam. And so during colonial America, New York had a very romantic past. You had the big patroon ships along the Hudson, the Van Rensselaers and the Schuylers, who owned hundreds and thousands of acres of land which they farmed. And then during the American Revolution, I grew up in an area between New York City and the highlands of the Hudson, the so-called neutral ground, which for 7 years during the Revolution was fought over by both sides, both by regular army troops and by marauding groups called the Cowboys and the Skinners, who kind of terrorized everybody. So I grew up not very far from the old Army Road where George Washington marched his troops up to the Battle of White Plains, where Caleb Heathcote had a manor, the Manor of Scarsdale. And when I chose a doctoral dissertation, I didn't have to go far because Scarsdale was where James Fenimore Cooper wrote his first American novel, a novel called The Spy, A Tale of the Neutral Ground, which was a fictionalized story of George Washington's favorite secret agent. And so all of this kind of romantic aura. I was also in Washington Irving's country. We'd go up to Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow, and it was a wonderful place to take a date on a Friday afternoon after school. So I grew up with the romance of history all around me. And I probably would have majored in American history, but at Williams, the only major available was American history and literature. And so I was also exposed to American writings, not only Fenimore Cooper, but Washington Irving and Emerson, Thoreau and Melville and Hawthorne, and all the great writers in American literature. And when it came time to choose a graduate specialty, I had to choose them between English and history, and I chose American literature to specialize in. So that's how the romance of history kind of dictated my path forward.
Do you know how many books you have written about Estes Park so far?
Well, I used to keep very close track because every year I had to turn into the department my annual bibliography. So I would redo it every year. I haven't done that for probably 10 years now. So I'd have to guess, but it's something like, with all the additions and the original histories, about 40.
Out of those, roughly 40, do you have any single publication that you're most proud of?
Well, I occasionally will dip into all of them, and each one in their own way is kind of interesting. Obviously, this Blue Hollow, because it did provide, I think, the first comprehensive history of early Estes Park, and then its continuation in America's Switzerland. But I got a big kick out of doing the book on McGregor Ranch. That was because the McGregors saved everything. So it was simply going through what was already stored out there at the ranch. That biography almost wrote itself. But every book in its own way has been kind of fascinating. Doing the biography of F.O. Stanley was very interesting because I got a chance to go back to Kingfield, Maine, where he grew up, and got to see where he started. And the Stanley Museum is in the old schoolhouse in Kingfield that the Stanleys gave to the town of Kingfield. So that was interesting. And then Joe Mills, who I've always kind of admired as a student athlete and being an all-around rather nice guy. That was fun as well because it all came out of all the materials were in this chest that Pat Washburn one day delivered down here to the museum. We opened up that chest and there was a book inside it. So each one has its own kind of history, each in its own way fascinating. And for the time that I'm working on it, it becomes, it takes over one's life. And so for that time at least, it becomes the center of one's existence.
And would you like to share a little bit about what you're currently working on?
Right now, I'm finishing up a rather lengthy, I don't know whether it will be a small book or a long paper on Peter Hondius. Not our Peter of today, but his father, who came to Estes Park from Holland in 1895 at the age of 31. Married into the James family of Elkhorn Lodge, so you've got that marvelous story connected. And then became the largest single land owner and holder in Rocky Mountain National Park. And together with lands along Fall River, probably controlled almost as much, if not more, land than either the Earl of Dunraven or F.O. Stanley did. So it's an interesting story.
So you hold the title of the town historian laureate. When did you become the historian?
Well, that happened in 1986, and I can still remember the evening. I don't know what the occasion was, whether it was the annual meeting of the Friends or some other evening event, but John Boddick, the mayor, was there, and all of a sudden I was being called up. I had no idea that this was in the works. As a matter of fact, I was so taken by the title of Historian Laureate that I looked up online to see if there were any other historian laureates, and I only found one, and he was in Kentucky and he was dead. So I felt that I had a real distinction, and you know, I was honored and flattered, and more than words can say.
What do you think it means to the community of Estes Park to have a historian laureate?
Well, I guess because I can become the kind of go-to guy. So just this morning, there was a question that came up for the newspaper about a photograph they needed, and so they wrote. And at various times, people will call upon me to kind of fill them in on some historical incident or an individual, or give them some background for whatever they're working on, as well as other people who are working on historical subjects. And it's great fun to be able to help them and mentor them a bit and share with them materials that they might find helpful and relevant in their own work.
So let's talk about the museum a little bit. When did you first become involved with the Estes Park Museum?
I can't remember when I got involved. I can remember coming down here when the museum was much smaller and less attractive than it is today, and sitting around in the back room. I remember, and I'm blanking on her name, but she was the one that introduced me to the Charles Edwin Hughes's, not his biography, but his journal. And I remember she was going through it and putting individual pieces of paper, kind of marking dates and things. I thought this was kind of interesting. So eventually, I got a photocopy of that made, and we turned that into a small book, which the Friends Press published. And I don't know, way late on the way, I got involved with Marty Casey. We did those 4 volumes of the Annals of Estes Park, or whatever they're called, and that was an interesting project. And then, you know, I got involved with the Friends, and I served on the Friends board for about 10 years, and have been involved with the museum and its various directors for, gosh, since I guess the 1980s now.
Can you share with me some of the changes you've seen with the museum over the years?
Well, it's certainly improved. It's gotten far more professional. And Derek, you and your people are to be credited for that. Of course, the new wing has allowed you to display much better than the past some of the materials you have, getting a handle on them by getting the old senior center, so we now have a decent place to store those 25,000 items of one kind or another. So this museum has grown dramatically with the help of the town. You've got a fine staff, and with the help of the Friends, the sky's the limit.
Thank you for my compliment, too.
Yeah.
What would be your hopes and dreams for the museum, or just the history of Estes Park?
Well, there are so many stories about Estes Park to tell. A lot of them are family stories, and I would hope that some of the families here who have ties with people who go back to the earlier days will either volunteer to write them down or come in and record them in sessions like this. I hope that more people like, I'm blanking on his name, Bob Levitt, will do neighborhood histories. That's a logical project for every neighborhood to have its own history. Right now, when I'm working on Peter Hondius, he developed the whole High Drive area, so I've been kind of reconstructing a good portion of that history, and that's fascinating because of the Hondius pipeline, which brought water nearly 3 miles from Upper Revere Meadows all the way down to the High Drive. So each of the neighborhoods in Estes Park has its own story, its own history, its own cast of characters, and I hope people who in the future who are interested in history will write their neighborhood histories.
What have been major changes that you've seen take place on how you conduct your research over the years?
Well, the computer has made a heck of a lot of difference. I used to, as I explained, used to work exclusively with microfilms and would just turn the crank over and over, going through. I don't know how I didn't lose my sight trying to look at that old grainy stuff and putting the rolls of dimes. I had rolls of dimes and I would put the dimes in the machine and get copies. So now so many newspapers are in digital format, not only here in Colorado, but across the country. And so with this Hondius project, for example, I'm able to access newspapers in Hawaii. So I know their comings and goings even down to the day because the various ships that would dock, they would have lists of passengers. And some of the hotels would mention who their guests were and what the guests were doing. So I know where they stayed. All of that wouldn't have been possible to find 30 years ago because I would have had to go to Hawaii and use microfilm and put those dimes in. But you can put in, keywords and do word searches, and it's amazing what comes up. Particularly if you have an unusual name like Hondius. There aren't a lot of Hondiuses, although actually I've been trying to trace the Hondius family back into Netherlands history and then the wing of that family. So that in itself has proven interesting and challenging. But having access to newspapers online is just amazingly helpful. Also, the National Park has done a great job of digitalizing, as you guys have over here, digitalizing your materials. And so being able to do a word search in your catalog or the catalog over at the National Park, that speeds up things enormously. On the other hand, what I do miss is the serendipitous discoveries that I found in out-of-way places. I'd be looking for one thing, and all of a sudden I'd find something else, and then I'd spend a half a day going down that rabbit hole. So in one sense, it's a little less predictable, but certainly from terms of simply time expended and effort versus output, the computer has taken us a long way. And of course, my own writing. I used to do it on a typewriter, and then endlessly revising paragraphs with having to retype a whole page over again. Now it's just a matter of a keystroke and being able to store and save stuff. And now one worries that one's computer is going to crash as opposed to the typewriter falling on the floor. But things have changed immeasurably, and all for the better.
So let's talk about some major events that you've witnessed yourself here in Estes Park. Can you tell us any stories about the 1976 Big Thompson flood?
Yeah, I can. We were, back in those days, we still lived in Michigan, so we came west through to Illinois, into Iowa, and then across Nebraska. And we had reached, I think, North Platte, Nebraska. We were staying there. and the night before the Big Thompson flood. And not knowing anything about it, we got all the way to Loveland and heard that the canyon was closed, and came all the way around to Lyons, had lunch at the old Black Bear Inn, and then came up to Estes Park to discover that this catastrophe had taken place. And I can remember for days afterwards seeing the helicopters flying over, taking out people who had been killed, and also helping to remove some of the stuff that was littering the river down there. My sister was less fortunate. We were rendezvousing with them, and they came up the day before, and they were actually in the canyon when it started to rain. And they came all the way up, and she recalls that it was raining so hard when they reached the Estes Valley. They were staying at the Y camp, that they simply ran over to the Y camp, ran inside, and left all their luggage to be unloaded the next day. That's how hard it was raining. In terms of the Long Lake flood of '82, we were scheduled that day to take one of our favorite hikes, and it required going up. It was the trail up Estes Cone, and then down and dropping back down on the Y camp. And for that, you needed two cars, one to take you to the trailhead, and then one left at the Y camp to pick you up and come get the other car. And we were hiking with some friends from Michigan, our next door neighbors, as a matter of fact. And we got, gosh, where did we get to? We hadn't gone very far when it became quite apparent that something was going on. So we decided we better go downtown and take a look. And so we were in the post office parking lot. And I'll never forget a police car coming wheeling around the corner and saying, "You have 5 minutes to get out of here because there's a flood on its way." So then what we did was we drove all the way back up to Deer Ridge Junction, left the car there, and walked around behind on the backside of the north side of Deer Mountain, where there's a trail. And we followed that trail all the way back to the village so we could see the water below us. And I'll never forget coming into the village and seeing the destruction. There used to be a nice leather store, Lord Latigo's, at the head of Elkhorn Avenue, and all the leather stuff had been washed out and was all over the place. And I remember a lot of the merchants, because the water had subsided by the time we got there, trying to save whatever they could. It was an absolute disaster. But to see that water, that wall of water, cascading down Fall River into the town, past the old Army Navy store, which used to be on West Elkhorn, it was a catastrophe. So in that case, we missed the Big Thompson flood, but we were kind of right in the middle of the Long Lake flood.
Okay, going with the themes of flood, can you tell us about the 2013 flood?
Sure. Well, by that time, of course, we had the house in Little Valley, and so we were totally cut off from the rest of Estes Park. And I remember the neighborhood got together. We kind of pooled the food that we had. Fortunately, the electricity never went out. We had no toilets. We had no running water, but we did have electricity. And so all the neighbors, we were kind of stranded from the rest of the world because Fish Creek Road was all torn up. And so we would get together every evening and have a cocktail party. And somebody would have, during the day, would have waited across the river, come into town, picked up the local news, and so they'd come back and share it over a glass of wine. Finally, the flood was in September. I think in October, we went off to Vietnam, where they at least had toilets. So that's how we survived the 2013 flood. So yeah, we've been here through all the three floods, and of course then the disastrous fire a couple of years ago, and the fire last year. which came within about 500 yards of our door. So when you come to Estes Park, you learn to respect nature and deal with nature, and you come to understand it in ways that are, for most people, are literally impossible. I wouldn't say I court those episodes, having to go through them, but they sure are learning experiences.
Have you written up any of the first-hand accounts of those events?
No, I haven't, because those first-hand accounts are so idiosyncratic. I don't think people really want to know how I survived them. Each individual has its own story. I remember there were several books written after the Big Thompson flood of '76 with individual vignettes of what people were doing at various times. And maybe, down the road, there's a project for some erstwhile historians to come and collect those stories, what people were doing at these various turning points of history, and put them together in anthology form. But I don't think I'm going to do that.
And I probably should have asked earlier, you brought up your house there in Little Valley.
Yeah.
When did you get that house, and when did you become a permanent resident in Estes?
Well, we'd gotten to know Ed Herman, who was an artist here in Estes Park, really good watercolorist, and we have, over the years, had purchased a number of his paintings. And we were in his shop one day, and we'd been kind of toying with the idea of maybe buying a piece of property. And Ed and his wife were there, and they had just bought a lot in a place called Centennial Hills. And we didn't know why it was called Centennial Hills. We learned later that it was named after Michener's novel, because some of the early settlers, pioneer scenes had been, I guess it was an Indian encampment, had been filmed in Centennial Hills. So anyway, we went out with Janet Romer, the realtor, and before we knew it, we bought this 2.5 acres of lot. And we would pay. We took out a 10-year note and would pay on it every month, and we thought it was absolutely a stupidest thing we ever had done. We would never do anything, and in fact, we would come to the Y camp and we wouldn't even come over and look at the lot because we were so sure that it was a stupid thing to have done. But finally, we decided, well, if we had this lot, now we own the lot. And we're paying quite a bit in taxes because Colorado, perhaps wisely, back then taxed vacant land fairly heavily to prevent speculation. So we found an architect in Boulder, and he designed a house. And so in 1992, we built this house, and had no idea that we ever spend any more than 2 weeks a year there, because I was still heavily involved at the university. But we did, and we enlarged the house a couple of times and made up for all the things we didn't do the first time round. And then I retired there in 2013, so we've been living here almost for a decade ever since.
So if you had to pick your favorite historic character from Estes Park, who would it be and why?
I'm often asked that question. And so I turn over a lot of thoughts in my mind. I think of the Earl of Dunraven, but he only was here once or twice, and so his would be a partial view. And anyway, he was just in it to raise cattle and take care of tourists. I think of Isabella Bird and the experiences that she had in 1873. And it would be fun to see Estes Park through her particular eyes. I think of F.O. Stanley, who did so much for the town, not just building that hotel, but giving us a complete infrastructure for the village. So he's another person that I might consider. I would avoid Enos Mills because of those stories I'd heard back as a kid. Although I have great respect for what he did, both as an author and as a campaigner for Rocky Mountain National Park. I might pick Joe Mills, his younger brother, because Joe, as I say, was really a nice guy and a student athlete, and was engaged in all kinds of athletic things, from shinning up a flagpole down in Fort Collins at Colorado Agricultural College to playing football for 4 or 5 colleges and actually coaching at others and becoming the athletic director at Baylor. So he would be a logical candidate. Peter Hondy is who I'm working on now. It would be fun. But you know, the person I think I probably would choose would be Abner Sprague, because Abner saw it all. He came up here for the first time in 1869, came up from where he was living in the Loveland area. He talks about having seen Rocky Mountain Jim and Griff Evans setting fence posts down in somewhere along the valley floor. And so 1869, in 1875, he's in Moraine Park, or Willow Park as it was called then, and he takes a homestead cabin and turns it into a ranch and resort. And then he goes over, after he leaves Moraine Park, he goes over to Glacier Basin and starts Sprague's Lodge. And so he's there all throughout those formative years when Rocky Mountain National Park was formed. Leaves us lots of memories about his dealings with the federal government. And it's alive into the early years of World War II, and actually shows up at the recruiting office with an old musket and tries to volunteer for the American Army. And makes Life magazine because of it. So yeah, I think I would choose Abner Sprague, and a very, very wise man too. He wrote pretty well, and he was in many ways our first historian. During the 1920s, he wrote a series of papers based upon his own firsthand memories of what it was like here, and they really are helpful for anybody trying to reconstruct the history of the valley. So as a tribute to maybe our first historian, he's the one I would choose.
What was the most surprising thing you've learned during your research about the people of Estes Park?
That's an interesting question. This is a remarkable community, and having studied the history of it and reviewed the history of it, I'm aware of the number of remarkable people who have come here, not only as residents, but as summer visitors. You could write a who's who of America based on the people who've come through this valley. I think Estes Park is remarkable because of its resilience. We've talked about the various disasters that have occurred, and I think of what happened after the Long Lake flood and the way in which the town pulled itself together, started a renewal district, Epura, and what it did in terms of improving the looks of Elkhorn Avenue. So it looks far better than it did in the old photographs of the 1920s, and certainly looks a lot better than when I was a kid coming up here. So the resilience of the people, we seem to get often bogged down on local issues, and so I guess like in any small community, there's a fair amount of disputations and acrimony. But this is a fun place to get one's arm around and watch and chart and trying to trace its development from the very beginning. Where is it going? I suspect that 100 years from now, Estes Park will still be a playground for thousands and millions of people every year. They'll continue to come here because of Rocky Mountain National Park. My hope would be that we can take some of the pressure off the park by developing Forest Service lands around here for recreational purposes. I think a bike trail, mountain biking trails in particular, is being something which one could open up on federal land that the Forest Service controls, because their mission is the wise use of natural resources as opposed to conservation like the national park. But I suspect Estes Park 100 years from now will be much the same it is today. I would hope that by then we would have a storage facility for our museum, but I'm sure the museum will be just as important, just as central, and that people will come here to learn about Estes Park's past, even as I did in my time.
So on top of giving your time as Historian Laureate to the community, you also have served in other capacities with the community. Can you just tell us about some of the groups you worked with? Like
Yeah, you know, in Estes Park, when you retire, most people find that getting involved in various organizations is important. So in addition to the museum and the Friends, I served a few years on the Friends of the Library. And then in 2013, through Greg Rosner, I got involved in starting an economic development corporation, and that was really challenging because I knew, like many people knew, that if we were going to protect the environment, we had to have a viable economy. Without a viable economy, there are no jobs, and then without jobs, there are no younger families who can live here. Ultimately, there may not be any school system, and that there are lots of things like childcare and workforce housing that need to be addressed. And so we put together the Estes Park Economic Development Corporation. And I chaired that group for 6 years, and that was fun. And then I got involved in the Rocky Mountain Nature Association, now the Rocky Mountain Conservancy, back in, I think, about 2015. And I served 3 years as board president. And that was interesting and important because that organization provides over $2 million a year in support for Rocky Mountain National Park's activities. We provide the newspapers that you pick up when you go into the park, and the Junior Ranger Program booklets and badges, and the Conservation Corps helps take care of the trails. It's a great organization. So that was fun, and I'm still on that particular board, as I'm on the board of the EDC still. So I've done those kinds of things. And then serving in other, when asked in other tasks. It seems to me that when you come to a community like Estes Park, even if you say you're retired, it's important to give back to the community as best you can, and if you can do it in terms of finances, that's great, or if you can do it in terms of time and service. And clearly the amount of service that retirees give to this village is magnificent and enormous.
Do you have any other stories or antics you'd like to share, or any other individuals you'd like to mention?
No, well, yes. We asked about individuals to mention. I certainly should mention my wife, Patricia, because over all these years, whether I was doing the anthologies, whether I was doing the histories, she was content to give me the time and the space I needed to do them. So it's been a great partnership. We've been married now for well over 60 years. And my sister has also, who now is a resident of Estes Park, Nancy Thomas, who's an historian in her own right. She and I got together when we did that book on William Allen White, and now she's working on a biography of Flora Stanley, which I'm sure will be a great addition to our knowledge of the Stanley heritage in Estes Park. So those people have been very, very important, as indeed the thousands of people that I've met here in Estes Park. Great people, great friendships. It's a great place to visit, and it's even a better place to retire.
Great. Anything else you'd like to share?
No.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.